In the final days of 1989, while the world was celebrating Christmas, Romania turned on its TV and watched its dictator die. But how did a regime built on silence, fear, and control collapse in just a few days? And why was his death shown live? This is the story of the most shocking revolution ever broadcast. For decades, Romania didn't scream, didn't fight back, didn't even whisper, not because it didn't want to, but because it couldn't. Under Nicolae Ceaușescu, Romania became a country of secrets, where even thinking the wrong thought could get you vanished. Ceaușescu wasn't just a dictator, he was a myth, a father figure, a godlike presence orchestrated by one of the most terrifying secret police systems in the world, the Securitate. 500,000 informants, microphones hidden in homes, children encouraged to report their own parents. In a country of just 23 million people, it meant 1 in every 50 might be watching you. But the strange part? He wasn't always hated. In the 1960s, Ceaușescu was seen as a bold reformer. He condemned Stalin, distanced Romania from Moscow, and even got a standing ovation for denouncing the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. The West loved it. The IMF, the World Bank, and even the White House opened their wallets. Romania, communist but independent, was suddenly fashionable. But that was the mask. Behind closed doors, Ceaușescu was falling in love with something else entirely: total control. After a visit to North Korea and China in 1971, he came back obsessed, with parades, with slogans, with the idea of ruling not just a government, but the human spirit. That's when the transformation began. He launched his cultural revolution. His face appeared daily on TV. Textbooks rewrote his childhood into legend. Hospitals, schools, even parks were renamed after him. His wife, Elena, with no real scientific background, was crowned an academic genius, a chemist, a national treasure. They were no longer politicians. They were a dynasty. And behind it all, the fear machine ran smoothly. But fear can't feed people. And by the 1980s, hunger had crept into every Romanian kitchen. Why? Because Ceaușescu had made a promise to repay Romania's entire foreign debt. And to do it, he sold everything: food, fuel, electricity. The people were left with ration cards, dark homes, and freezing winters. But the dictator had his pride and his palace. The palace of the people, built with forced labor and marble, was larger than the Pentagon. Meanwhile, entire neighborhoods were bulldozed to make room for it. So the question is, how do you tear down a man who thinks he's a god? How do you ignite a revolution in a country that doesn't even have the right to raise its voice? The answer would come from the West, from a small protest in a forgotten city, and a mistake that Ceaușescu would broadcast to the world. It started with a pastor, just a soft-spoken Protestant pastor named Laszlo Tokes in the city of Timișoara. He had criticized the regime, nothing dramatic. But in a system like Ceaușescu's, words could be fatal. The authorities moved to evict him. That should have been the end of it. Remove the threat quietly, like they always did. But this time, people stayed. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. What were they thinking? That maybe this was the moment? Maybe someone else would stand with them. And someone did. And then another. By the next day, the square was overflowing. These weren't trained agitators. They were students, factory workers, mothers with children. They didn't have weapons, just courage. But the regime didn't blink. Troops arrived, tanks rolled in, and when the chants didn't stop, the shooting started. People dropped where they stood. Some were dragged away. Others, they say, were dumped into rivers or buried in mass graves overnight. But the news got out. Hungarian media aired footage of bodies. Western journalists picked up the scent. And for the first time in years, Romania couldn't lie fast enough to keep up. Timișoara had whispered. And now the country was listening. And still, Ceaușescu didn't see it coming. On December 21st, he tried to put on a show. A massive rally in Bucharest, broadcast live on television. Tens of thousands were bussed in. They were supposed to cheer. They were supposed to clap. Pre-recorded applause blasted from loudspeakers to set the mood. He stepped onto the balcony like he'd done 100 times. He started to speak, and then something broke. A murmur from the back of the crowd, then shouting, then chaos. The cameras caught his face. Frozen, confused, he turned to his wife. He tried to quiet the crowd. The feed cut. And for the first time in 24 years, Nicolae Ceaușescu was no longer in control of the noise. The next morning, the revolution had a pulse. Protesters stormed government buildings. Soldiers began defecting. Even TV stations were overtaken by weeping anchors, admitting decades of lies. The city wasn't silent anymore. It was screaming. At the Central Committee headquarters, Ceaușescu panicked. His guards were overwhelmed. His ministers were vanishing. He had no plan, just a helicopter on the roof. At 12:29 on December 22nd, he and Elena climbed aboard. For the last time, the palace that took thousands of lives to build would watch them flee into the sky. But they weren't escaping. They were falling into history. The helicopter rose above Bucharest like a ghost escaping its own grave. Inside, Ceaușescu and his wife, Elena, sat hunched, pale, disoriented. No longer rulers, just fugitives. Below them, the city they had silenced for decades was now erupting. Crowds were tearing down portraits. Soldiers were switching sides. And somewhere, someone was already drafting a death sentence with their names on it. Their first stop was Snagov, a private residence north of the capital. Ceaușescu was still clinging to the illusion that he could regroup, call in loyalists, crush the uprising. But the calls he made were met with silence, or worse, rejection. No soldiers were coming, no convoy, no orders obeyed. The regime he built had collapsed faster than he could say, "Comrade." Their pilot warned them they had to leave again, now. There were no reinforcements, and their helicopter was now a target. Military radio chatter was clear. Any unidentified aircraft will be shot down. With no choice, the pilot landed on a rural road near Târgoviște. The two most feared people in Romania were now standing on the side of a road, like fugitives hitchhiking their way out of a failed state. A passing car stopped. A bicycle mechanic named Petre offered them a ride, without realizing who they were. He took them to a nearby agricultural institute. But once the staff recognized them, they were locked in a room, and the police were called. The Ceaușescus were arrested, searched, and taken to a local military garrison. Not for protection, but for processing. Meanwhile, back in Bucharest, the revolution was in full swing. But something wasn't sitting right. Even though the dictator was gone, the fear wasn't. Rumors swirled. Ceaușescu had escaped to Moscow. He was planning a counterattack. Loyalists were setting bombs. Terrorists were sniping from rooftops. No one knew what was true, and that was the point. Panic doesn't need facts. It just needs doubt. The new provisional government, desperate to calm the storm, made a decision. They wouldn't wait. There would be a trial. It would be swift, and it would be televised. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were dragged into a makeshift courtroom inside a military base. The camera was rolling. There was no jury, no defense attorney, no deliberation. The charges were read aloud: genocide, abuse of power, theft of billions, betrayal of the people. Elena shouted. Nicolae scoffed. They refused to recognize the court, claiming they were still the rightful leaders of Romania. But it didn't matter. The verdict had been decided long before the trial began. Death, immediate execution, no appeal. They were given minutes to process it. Their hands were tied with shoelaces. A firing squad assembled. Elena cursed. Nicolae began singing the socialist anthem with eerie calm. They were led into the courtyard. A blank concrete wall awaited them. The cameras rolled, and then... Over 120 bullets ended the regime. But the revolution wasn't over. In fact, the hardest part had just begun. The next day, Romania turned on its televisions. Families gathered, stunned, silent, and there it was, the trial, the shouting, the blurry footage of two bodies crumpled against a cold barracks wall. The Ceaușescus were gone. No more statues, no more speeches, no more fear. That was the idea. But the broadcast wasn't just a conclusion, it was a message, a performance, a televised exorcism. After decades of manipulation, the new leaders knew something important. Truth alone wasn't enough. They needed symbolism. They needed to show the people, really show them, that it was over, that the dictator was dead, that the machine had stopped. So they aired the footage, and millions watched. Some cried, some cheered, some felt nothing at all, because when you live too long inside a lie, even freedom feels confusing. The trial was, by all legal standards, a farce. No lawyer, no defense, no due process. A show trial in combat fatigues, recorded with a shaky Soviet camera. But in that moment, few cared. After years of hunger, cold, humiliation, the people needed closure, even if it came wrapped in blood and propaganda. But closure is never that easy. In the years that followed, Romania tried to rebuild. Democratic elections were held. Romania joined NATO, later the European Union. But the shadow lingered. Former regime officials quietly resurfaced in politics. Files from the Securitate revealed betrayals between friends, family members, even children turning in parents. Trust was harder to rebuild than any city. And the palace, the monstrous golden monument Ceaușescu forced into existence, still stands today. It houses the Romanian parliament, a government born in revolution, working beneath chandeliers he installed. As for the footage of the execution, it still circulates. It's taught in schools, analyzed by historians, exploited in conspiracy videos. For some, it's proof of justice. For others, proof that revolution can be just as brutal as the regime it overthrows. But for everyone who watched it that Christmas, whether on a flickering screen in a crumbling apartment or on a borrowed TV in a rural village, it meant one thing: the silence was broken. Because the death of a dictator wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a country asking itself a terrifying question. Now that we're free, what comes next? Romania's revolution remains one of the most surreal moments of the 20th century, not just for how fast it happened, but for how vividly it was broadcast. A dictator built a world of cameras, of control, of illusion, and in the end, it was those same cameras that recorded his fall. But history doesn't end with a gunshot or a blurry tape. It lingers, it mutates, and it echoes in every country where power still demands silence. If this story made you think, reflect, or look at modern revolutions differently, share it. Comment below. Do you believe the trial was justice or just revenge? Would the country have healed without it? And could something like this ever happen again? Thanks for watching. And remember, history doesn't just live in books. Sometimes it lives on tape.